Hello once again. Something Juita spoke about resonated with me. She spoke about courage. And Geraldo Rivera, in one of the journalism quotes, he said, courage in journalism is sticking up for the unpopular and not the popular. I believe that our multiculturalism and our diversity is what is our strength as journalists starting up in Canada. She also spoke about the fact that you come here with all your wealth of experience and they're asking you for Canadian experience. It was very confusing for me. But I still believe that our strength is saying our stories and telling our stories the way we want it to be told, because we have lived the truth. No other person has lived my truth. No other person here has lived your truth. And that's our strength. That's what we should stick up for when they ask us for Canadian experience. Our next speaker is Yaldaz Sadakova. I do hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. Yalda is a Toronto-based writer and journalist. She covered the Great Recession in New York City, the Euro crisis in Brussels, as well as institutional investing and Canadian pension funds in Toronto. She moved to Canada in 2013. She's the creator of foreignish.net, where she publishes memoir stories about the emotional side of immigration. Sadakova moved to Toronto in 2013, like I said. She says that photography and mindfulness are her other passions. And she joins us today in our second workshop to discuss what makes Canadian journalism different. I hope we would enjoy this session. Yeah, Yalda?
Technology, it always makes me a little nervous. Well, this is a beautiful venue, and it's great to see all of you here today. And I guess just to give you my quick backstory, you already heard most of it. I was actually born and raised in Bulgaria, and I came to Canada 7 years ago, but in many ways I actually still feel like a new Canadian, even though I did get my citizenship recently, and it was a very special moment. But I was born and raised in Bulgaria, and I fell in love with journalism when I was in undergrad in Bulgaria. And that's when I got this idea that maybe I should apply for a master's degree in journalism and go to journalism school at Columbia in New York City. And at the time, it seemed like a really long shot for a poor kid from a poor country to be aiming for an Ivy League school, no money. So I had to apply for a scholarship, and I thought, okay, maybe this will work, maybe it won't work, but let's give it a try. It ended up working out. So in 2008, I graduated from journalism school, and fortunately for me, it happened to be the height of the global recession. So events like the collapse of Lehman Brothers and mass layoffs and newspapers and media outlets just folding. Those things happened just a few months after I graduated from journalism school, which made finding a journalism job really tricky. But I did get a job at a local newspaper in Queens. So, shout out to all the print people. I think print does give you very important skills. And anyway, I stayed at that job for a few months, but then I was laid off as well, like so many of my journalism colleagues. So I went back to Europe. I went to Brussels, and fortunately for me, it was the height of the Euro crisis. So I started, and again, it was a very dramatic time. It was youth unemployment. So for people like me, it was something like 25%, 50%. It was a really depressing time to be a young person starting your career, especially in a field like journalism. But I stayed in Brussels for almost 3 years and covered various aspects of the Euro crisis. I was working as a freelancer, so I was doing mostly TV and radio, but also some online writing on the side. And then I came to Toronto. That was 7 years ago. Luckily, there was no economic crisis this time, and I was fortunate. I started working at a business magazine here called Benefits Canada, and I stayed there for 3 years. And then I ended up resigning from that job with the intention to do some freelancing, to go back to freelancing, but also to focus on some personal creative writing projects. So here I am today. That's my story. And I've written also quite a bit about my journalism experience, especially the less glamorous side of it, on my blog, foreignish.net, which was mentioned. So if you're curious, you can learn more about that journey. But I wanted to ask you, because I wasn't here at the beginning, how many of you guys have been in Canada for less than a year? Okay, so maybe like a third or less than a third. And how many of you have been here less than 5 years? Okay, and I guess less than 10 years? Last question, okay. Okay, so all of us, I guess, are relatively new, like we haven't spent our entire lives in Canada. Okay. Well, I guess I have to do this, but just to give you before we dive into what I wanted to talk about today, just to give you the overview. So I will talk a little bit about the barriers that us immigrant journalists here in Canada face. And then afterwards, I want to focus on offering some practical guidelines, some practical tips about the things that you need to know in order to be a journalist in Canada, about the expectations that an editor here would have of you, whether you're approaching them as a freelancer looking to pitch a freelance story, or whether you're looking to join their outlet as a staffer. And so I guess I should start with an anecdote. Last year, yeah, that was last year, I saw this really cool job ad. It was for a staff reporter at The Logic, which is a relatively new online outlet. And I got so excited because I was like, oh my God, I meet most of the requirements. I've covered the economy. Like, most of my journalism background is in business reporting. And I've had all of these diverse experiences. I should like totally apply. So I applied, wrote a nice cover letter, prepared my resume, answered like a long online questionnaire that they had. So did all of that and felt like cautiously optimistic because, whenever you feel like, oh yeah, like I meet the requirements, I think I have a chance here, hit submit, and then of course, crickets. I didn't hear from them for about a month maybe, and by then I figured, okay, this is a no. But then the managing editor contacted me and sent me a very polite, Canadians are very polite, right? He sent me a very polite rejection email, and I want to tell you what it said, part of what it said. So here's what he said after rejecting me very politely. As you know, Canadian media jobs are in short supply, and there is an excess of talent, which can be disheartening both for applicants and employers. So what he said, Tim Jordan, the editor who contacted me, he is absolutely right. This is essentially the problem with the Canadian journalism industry. There is an excess of talent, but not enough jobs. And it's a very difficult industry to break into. Canadian mainstream journalism is a very difficult industry. Even if you were born and raised in Canada, let's say, you're a white person with a ton of inherited advantages, maybe you were middle class, upper middle class, even for that kind of person, it is very difficult to break into Canadian journalism. Now, what happens when you add to that factors such as being relatively new to Canada, not having much Canadian work experience, not having Canadian education, having a name like my own, which most people cannot pronounce, don't know how to spell, so a non-English name, and having a first language which is not English. What happens when you add these kinds of factors? Well, what happens is that it becomes exponentially more difficult to break into mainstream journalism. And so I do want to talk a little bit about these three factors I mentioned. Now, these three factors, they're not the only reasons why we get rejected, but they're some of the reasons. And so bias against non-native speakers. This one is just, it's terrible because so often, I have seen this so often where hiring editors and just even hiring managers in general in Canada, they equate having a foreign accent, having a foreign accent with lack of language proficiency. So I guess they haven't gotten the memo yet that having an accent doesn't mean that you're not proficient in English. But for whatever reason, it causes them to view you as the other and to question your language skills in a way that a native speaker's language skills will never be questioned. And I've seen even over the years so many job ads in media and communications and marketing. Yes, exactly. They're asking for a native speaker.
Or they ask, what's your native language?
Yes, what's your native language, right, which is,
Arabic.
yeah. So they make that wrong assumption that maybe you
Speak English.
Exactly. So this is discrimination. This is nothing short of discrimination, but it's something that is held against us. Another thing that is unfortunately held against us, for those of us who don't have English names, like me, for example, is having a foreign name. And unfortunately, it has been well documented that in Canada, if you send a resume and on top, the name on top is not English, your likelihood of being called for an interview and thus getting hired is lower than if there was an English name on top of that resume. So that's another very, very sinister form of discrimination that we face. And the third one, which you're all familiar with Joyita mentioned and all the speakers mentioned, is, of course, Canadian experience. Like those two words. And that, of course, is it's the well-documented phenomenon where Canadian employers devalue work experience and education gained outside of Canada, even though, of course, they claim to value diversity. How would you value diversity if you exclude somebody on the basis of the very things that make them diverse, right? It makes me very angry. And Canadian experience is discrimination. And that's not just my opinion, it's also the opinion of the Ontario Human Rights Commission. In 2013, the Commission issued a directive which said that employers asking for Canadian experience, this basically amounts to discrimination. And what I want to read you actually the sentence. What they say is, a strict requirement for Canadian experience is prima facie discrimination and can only be used in very limited circumstances. So what they're basically saying is that the onus is on the employer to prove that you absolutely need to have worked in Canada in order to be able to do the job, which is not what happens. And a few years ago, I actually wrote an op-ed, as you can see, about the fact that Canadian employers should not be asking immigrants for Canadian experience, not only because it is discriminatory, but also because it kind of threatens to turn us into an underclass of disaffected people, because it's essentially preventing us from contributing our skills. It's preventing us from contributing fully to Canadian economy and to Canadian society, and that's a recipe for creating a group of disaffected people. So anyway, when I was researching that story, I learned an interesting thing from a Canadian person that I interviewed. And she said, actually, when employers ask for Canadian experience, they don't always mean those, those hard technical skills, which is what I had thought. She said that what they actually often mean is soft skills. Are you aware of the social etiquette in Canada? Are you able to communicate effectively with a Canadian in a Canadian workplace? And when I learned that, it pissed me off, because that's even more sinister, because skills you can measure, right?
It's like adding insult to injury.
Yeah, that's exactly what it is.
Do you question my people skills? Who do you think I am?
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Mm-hmm. A friend, when I came to Canada, told me, and I thought he was being cynical at the time. He said, you know, they think we're monkeys on trees, seriously. And I was like, no, no, you must be like joking. That was like my second week here. He was not being cynical. Yeah, so anyway, I do think it's sinister because you can at least measure objectively a person's skills. You can test them. You can verify, does somebody have this education or not? But to make it a cultural fit, this is totally subjective, and it really opens the door to all kinds, for all kinds of biases to creep in. So I did want to mention that even when they say Canadian experience, they don't necessarily mean that, oh, you don't have the skills. And so even though the Ontario Human Rights Commission has issued this directive, unfortunately, that directive is not a law, and unfortunately, most employers are not aware of it. And even in specifically even in journalism, even if an editor doesn't ask, okay, do you have Canadian experience? What they might end up asking is, well, do you have experience covering this aspect of, let's say, do you have experience covering investing in Canada? Or do you have experience covering, I don't know, Canadian politics? Which, again, to me, this is not the right type of question to ask, because as we know, part of the job of a journalist is to learn new beats. I mean, nobody bats an eyelash when, let's say, a white Canadian-born person is sent to, I don't know, to Kenya or to South Africa to become a bureau chief. They don't know anything about South Africa or Kenya, but suddenly they're parachuted in there and they're expected to learn the beat on the go. And that's what a journalist does. That's fine, but nobody says, whoa, 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 wait, he doesn't have Kenyan experience. But if we come from another country to Canada, they're like, whoa, you don't have Canadian experience. You have not covered Canadian politics or the Canadian economy, as if a journalist cannot learn on the job. This is what we do every day. Or they might ask silly things like, well, who's the premier of Ontario? Or what is the capital of, I don't know, Prince Edward Island? Well, these things you can Google and learn within a few seconds. They should be looking for skills which take years to develop, not things that you can, you can find out through Google within a few seconds. So as you can imagine, the consequences of this, the consequences of the fact that the barriers to entry for people like us are very high, the consequence is that we end up underrepresented in Canadian newsrooms. Not many of us get hired there. And unfortunately, there aren't any numbers specifically about the number of immigrant journalists in newsrooms, but we do know anecdotally that we are represented, especially when it comes to newer immigrants. So people who came to Canada as adults, not people who came here maybe when they were younger. We do know, but again, the data is very sparse, that journalists of color are also severely underrepresented in Canadian newsrooms, but not all journalists of color are immigrants. Some of them are, but not all of them are. So this makes it really difficult when it comes to looking for statistics. So we don't even have a proper, we're not even properly measuring the problem, but anecdotally, we do know that immigrant journalists are underrepresented. And I mean, even if you think, what was the last time when you turned on the TV or the radio and you saw an anchor or a reporter who spoke with a foreign accent?
There's one in CTV News.
Oh, really?
Yeah, his son, British.
Oh, he's
He has an accent.
I know, but it's a British Indian accent.
Yeah, he worked in, do you know where he worked before?
No, but he's an East Indian and he has the British East Indian accent. So that, yeah. The first guy was a guy named Jojo Chinto with a very African accent. And I'm good with accents. Thank you. My name is Derek, and I've been
Hi
here
again,
for 45 years. I came to Canada at the age of 5. And I've spent 30 years in the Canadian media sector. So I feel that much of what you say is true. It's actually, when you're an insider, even worse. I can share that, all these tips and techniques.
Please do, please do.
But the biggest thing is it's possible to get in with great work, great opportunity to get in, and the biggest barrier is between your ears and in your chest. You got to have a strong heart, you have a vision, and keep working. There are people who want you, but it's competitive. There are people who don't want you to get in because you'll take their job and their promotion. But anyway, I've lost track of the point I was trying to make. Obviously, a British accent, even a colonial British accent, is much better than in the ears of some than a very rough accent. But there was a big controversy when City TV had Jojo Chinto. Look up Jojo Chinto. It was a great moment in Canadian journalism when a middle-aged black man with a very heavy African accent. I'm good with accents. I have better than average hearing. It was tough to hear him sometimes and understand him. But for me, it was inspiring, born from Tanzania. And whether you are Bulgarian or Italian, for me, I grew up being one of the first and only. And it was tough walking into that room. And it was even worse when there was already an East Indian who was more comfortable with being or preferred to be the only one at the table. That is a painful moment. When you see somebody who's colder than anybody else in the room and they should be a little warmer. But anyway, it's so inspiring for me to be here in this room because I don't walk into journalism circles that look like this. It's phenomenal. You have no idea how inspired I am to have two Nigerians, and the dean here is South African, and I'm from an East African country. For me, it's phenomenal. Thank you. I'm happy to be part of this. And you're very inspiring. And when I met you, you didn't tell me you were from Columbia. So you graduated from Columbia University is what I meant. And so there's little moments where we need to know how to sell ourselves. Nobody teaches that. Like there's this thing about the elevator pitch, but I don't want to take too long talking about this. But anyway, you inspire me. And be yourselves and go out there and do this. It's possible, but it is very competitive. And you'll always have that grouch, Oscar the Grouch, who says, oh yeah, they're not that great or whatever, whether it's sometimes bull-faced in a meeting. You need to get past all that. But this is a very inspirational room. Keep coming to rooms like this. Keep moving forward. Keep getting the most out of organizations and gatherings and networks like this. It'll be a springboard for you. I'm even here with all my experience. That's how great it is.
I forgot to mention, please feel free to jump in at any time and to even interrupt me and make a comment or if you have a question. So yeah, please go ahead. Because I think it's easier if questions just arise in context. So, did you have a question? Yeah, please, go ahead.
Good morning.
Morning.
My name is Sayan. I am not a journalist over here, but I work with a refugee organization and I lead the programming of exiled journalists and writers. So I'm here just to gain as much knowledge to pass it on.
Mm-hmm.
I have just three things to say. First of all, having an accent, I feel, is an act of courage.
Yes.
And especially having an accent which you don't want to change. So that is one thing. The second is we all come from countries where we are taught not to speak about ourselves and our work must speak for ourselves.
Yes.
And that stands completely in it's contrarian to North American culture because I studied in America as well. I'm from Columbia as well. And this was one of the first things that was taught to me was speak about yourself.
Yeah.
It's difficult, but it is doable. But third, I just want to, one of the things that it's a question perhaps for everyone to discuss later, is we talk about acceptance over here when we come. I understand that because that is necessary. But we should also ask ourselves what happens to a non-white journalist coming to our country and wanting to work in our industry. How accepting are we of that? How do we evaluate those people who would want to come? Because in India, we have a lot of foreign journalists who come and work in India, cover India, but they cover India for foreign magazines and their home companies, organizations, not for Indian houses. From as far as I know, I just know one Indian long form journalism organization which had an American editor for the longest time. Having said that, given that understanding, that should propel the model we want to bring over here. Is how would we accept an outsider in our country should propel us to create the model over here for ourselves, how we want to be accepted. Because understanding that might just lead us to perhaps at some level demand something that is not organic, because everyone on the other side of the fence is also human and they also have their prejudices as we have. It's only now that we feel the prejudice because we are on the other side of the fence, whereas we used to be inside the compound in our own countries. So perhaps we can discuss something like that also.
Yeah.
Get in. Get in. Sorry. It's a bit of a waste of time to be too generous, too biased. And I mean, it's great if we had all the time, but you have lives and careers you want to build and dreams to go after. Be the best that you can be. Because they hire based on personality as well. So how can you be more driven and passionate? The way to get over the Canadian lack of is to be more passionate. They hire a lot of times based on passion. Passion for what you want.
Well, I didn't get that job based on passion. I mean, the logic job that I told you about, I was being passionate. I still didn't get it. But I mean, I think you're right. It's certain, being enthusiastic can certainly help your cause, as opposed to if you're just like, yeah, totally, I'm very interested, and it doesn't look like you're very interested. But I mean, it's really complex. But maybe if we have time later on, we can address the issue that you raised about how journalists, I guess immigrant or foreign journalists are treated in our countries, because I do have a thought about that. I mean, I agree with you, but I also disagree a little bit, but we can talk about that. I just want to make sure that we're not late for Nicholas's session, but the point that I wanted to make is, so we were talking about the fact that we're basically severely underrepresented in Canadian mainstream newsrooms, and that what that results in is problematic coverage of immigrants and immigration, because the people who write about us, the people who cover us, the people who cover the issues that affect us look nothing like us. They have no idea what it's like to be an immigrant, but they're the ones covering immigration. And I wanted to share with you some of the problems that I see as an immigrant reader, not necessarily as a journalist, but as an immigrant reader when I consume this kind of coverage, the things that kind of irk me. One of them is that I consistently see is that all immigrants are lumped in one category without any regard for intersectionality. The immigrant voice, the immigrant this, the immigrant that. There isn't one immigrant community. We're so diverse when it comes to race, when it comes to ethnicity, when it comes to religion, when it comes to class. You cannot put all immigrants in one category. So it really does bother me, because I feel that it erases the experiences of a lot of people. And we're every bit as diverse as non-immigrants, our communities, but we're somehow denied that complexity. The other thing that really bothers me about coverage is that I feel that we're often depicted in two ways. One way is we're presented as poor victims who always need some kind of help. Please provide winter jackets. Please provide donations for these people. Oh, look, they're coming, like they're poor, they're uneducated, they're so confused, they don't know anything. Please help these people. So it's the kind of coverage that that would encourage pity. If you're reading it, you're like, oh God, poor people. So we're not seen as equals, but as people who just can be, pity, just presented as a charity case. It really bothers me. Another thing that I see is another strand of coverage is that our presence here is usually described as some kind of problem, there's some kind of concern, burden, exactly, burden on social services, burden on the infrastructure. Can Toronto afford to take more immigrants? Look what's happening to the streetcars, look what's happening to the TTC. Why is that always the discussion? Why are we positioned as a burden? So either we're presented as a burden or we're presented as a charity case, as people who have to be pitied, and that really, really bothers me. And just one other issue I want to highlight is that I often see stories about immigration, let's say very frequently about some kind of new immigration policy, and there's no quotes from immigrants in it. What the hell? What kind of journalism is that? You didn't even bother to find an immigrant who is affected by this to get a quote. Why is the, yeah, go ahead.
Even written by somebody who's lived all their lives in Canada, not an immigrant journalist.
Exactly. Well, yes, because we're not in those newsrooms, so yeah. Yeah, so for them it's an intellectual exercise. They don't know what it's like to have your life on hold while you're waiting for the Canadian government to process your visa, and you can't even contact them because you don't know what the hell is going on. So yeah, I get very angry. But I guess like all of this is to say that the obstacles that we face are, you know, they're very real. They're very serious obstacles. And I do want to state, I do want to state on the record that I do not believe that the onus should be on immigrants alone and on immigrant journalists alone to make an adjustment and to learn. I do believe that you know, media outlets, hiring editors, and even just employers more generally, they do need to make some very serious changes in the way they hire people, in the way they promote people, because for the most part, we remain excluded. So I do not think the onus should be entirely on us. And I personally, I'm a little bothered when people, you know, when people try to tell us immigrants, oh, you know, just work hard. All it takes is to work hard. Oh, really? Then how come we're not always getting the outcomes that we want? It's not all about hard work. I mean, hard work matters, but these institutional obstacles, that institutional discrimination that we face, these obstacles are not easy to surmount with individual effort. Like, individual effort can really take you far, but there's only, you know, so far that you can go. So I really do want to acknowledge that before moving on to the you know, to the rest of the session, where I do want to talk about some tips and tricks. So I do want to make it clear that I don't think the onus should be entirely on us. But that being said, having a victimhood mentality and, you know, just like staying angry and feeling defeated and depressed doesn't help either, because there are certain things that we can do, you know, within the restrictions that we have. There are certain steps that we can take. And in our case, one of those steps is to learn more about the Canadian media landscape and to learn what editors would expect from you, so that you can position yourself better, so that you can prove them wrong, so that you can give them fewer reasons to reject you, because they already have many reasons why they want to reject you. And so I guess when talking about the media landscape, just two main things that I want to highlight is that most of the media outlets in this country, you probably already know this, they're owned by a very small number of corporations. So corporations such as Rogers, Bell, St. Joseph Communications, they own most of the outlets that we have here. And the other important thing is that it's a very small industry. I learned this very quickly when I got here. It seems that in the GTA, all journalists seem to know each other. It seems that they've all worked together at previous jobs, or they all went to Ryerson. Well, for those of us that didn't go to Ryerson, that's too bad. But they all know each other, and then people move around a lot, so you really never know somebody that you're working with today. You might still encounter them 5 years down the road at another job. So what this means for you, I think, is that it's very important to network. It's very important to meet people, because who you know is so important. You know, when I first moved to the West, I had these very naive notions about the West, because I grew up in a communist country, in a dictatorship where there was like a lot of corruption, nepotism, cronyism. And I would look to the West and I would think, wow, this is a meritocracy. Your skills, your education, that's all that matters. Yeah, right. So then I was very quickly disappointed. And I have seen firsthand, even here in Canada, even in journalism, who you know absolutely matters. And so often it actually even trumps, other factors, because as long as an editor knows you, like it can make things much easier for you. So definitely always build connections. Do not burn bridges if you can. And I want to about some of the expectations that an editor here will have from you, whether you're approaching them as a freelancer just to pitch a story, just a cold pitch, or whether you're working as a staffer in a newsroom. And they do have a lot of expectations. And the first one is, I think this is pretty obvious, is that they would expect you to have a professional online presence, because if they don't know you, one of the first things they'll do is they'll Google you. And you do want to have a professional LinkedIn profile with enough detail just to give them an idea of what kind of stories you cover, what your professional experience is, and if you can, to include links to your previous clips, or if you do TV or radio, your news segments or your audio segments, and to always make sure that it doesn't have any typos or errors, because as I said, we're held to a different standard. Oh, English is not your first language. This is why this typo is there. So I always feel, even when I post on social media, that I have to always proofread it, because I know it can be held against me. Another helpful thing is to, if you can, to post your clips in an online portfolio. There are free websites I use Contently, where you can load more clips, because I don't know how many you're able to load on LinkedIn, but anyway, it's important to have a professional online presence. And yeah.
I think after the workshop, you could share some of those. If you share them with maybe Jolita, right? And then we could share them with the collective and as well as people in the room. I'd be very interested to know some of these tools and
Yeah.
thank you.
Yeah, we can do that. I can show you what I mean, yeah. And I guess another thing that an editor here would expect you to have is the ability to pitch stories. So this is exactly what Joita was mentioning earlier. So here in Canada, it is totally acceptable for you to send a cold pitch to an editor that you don't know, to a publication that you don't have a relationship with, because you want to pitch a story. But pitching is also a very important skill, even if you're working as a staffer, and actually even if you're working as a communications person, because pitching is basically the ability to see story ideas. You look around and you're able to identify stories, and you're able to tell, oh, this is going to be a good story. So that's why I do want to spend a little bit of time just talking about what makes a good pitch. What would an editor here expect when you're pitching a story as a staffer or as a freelancer? And the first thing, this is actually one of the main mistakes that people make, is that when they present a pitch to an editor, they frame it as a question. So for example, let's say Canada has a new family reunification policy. What would that mean for immigrants? And they leave it at that, just as a question. But a question is not a pitch. A pitch means that you have done enough research that you kind of know what the answer is, and you already have an idea of who are some of the sources that you would talk to, because an editor needs as much detail as possible, because from their standpoint, they're going to write a check. They want to commission you to do this story, but they want to know what the story will be about. If you just leave it at that question, they're not sure. So your pitch will likely get rejected, especially if the editor doesn't know you. And it's also important to pick a very specific angle, because you can't write about everything or cover everything within a story or one news segment. So pick a specific angle. Another very common mistake that I see is sometimes people just blast pitches out into the universe, and they're not necessarily...
I used to do that actually.
Yeah?
Because I work in media relations.
Yeah.
And I would pitch to practically every news outlet in town.
Mm-hmm.
And I would do it bilingual. I'm perfectly bilingual. I speak English and French. I would do the French media and the English media.
Mm-hmm. But it doesn't help, unfortunately, because when the editor sees that it's not relevant to their outlet, it's the fastest way to get a no. So I would definitely recommend that you spend some time just looking at what they've covered previously, what kind of stories, so that your pitch is kind of very similar to the things that they normally cover. Another important thing, if you're pitching specifically as a freelancer and they don't know you, is to explain why you should cover this story, why you are the best person to cover this story. So maybe you already have experience covering this subject matter, or in your case, as was previously mentioned, I think a huge advantage that you have is that all of you have lived immigration experience. So let's say if it's an immigration story, definitely mention that you have this firsthand lived experience, and definitely mention that you're bilingual or multilingual, because not many Canadian journalists are multilingual, right? So, especially if it's relevant to the community that you're trying to cover, because speaking certain languages can give you more direct access to certain sources and to certain communities. And one last thing, if you're pitching as a freelancer, is to mention in the subject line that the story is time sensitive, if it happens to be time sensitive, because you don't want the person ignoring it, and by then it's old news. And do mention that you're not a PR person, again, in the subject line, so something like a pitch from a journalist, because editors get a ton of pitches from communications people, and they often ignore them. So if they don't know your name, and if your pitch sounds very salesy in the subject line, they might assume you're a communications person, and there goes your hard work. So another huge thing that editors will expect from you here is to adhere to certain ethical standards. So this is not to say that the Canadian media landscape is a paradise and everybody follows these to the T, but these standards, ethical standards, are very important, and they're there for a reason, and they would expect that you would follow them. So the first one is that you are never allowed to accept any payments or any types of favors from a source. This is an absolute no-no. Another important thing is that you cannot have any conflict of interest. So for example, let's say you're a freelancer and you're also doing communications work for an oil and gas company. Well, then you wouldn't be the best person to write a story about climate change, I mean like a traditional reported story, because you're getting money from one of the stakeholders in the conversation. Another example of conflict of interest would be interviewing friends or people that you have a personal relationship with, because that totally jeopardizes your objectivity. So never interview friends, never interview people you have a personal relationship with. Make sure you have no conflict of interest. And you're also not allowed to pay sources any money in order to cover them. So if somebody doesn't want to be interviewed by you, that's fine. You can't pay them, you can't bribe them to photograph them or to interview them. And you're basically not allowed to do any favors to anybody, because the job of a journalist is not to offer favors to people. And a couple of other things: don't misrepresent yourself when you approach potential sources. Always identify yourself as a journalist. And the last one, which is really important, is you need to have a commitment to objectivity and fairness. And what that means in practical terms is that one-source stories are an absolute no-no. So if you interview one person, you're not ready to write an article, because this article will only represent one side of the story, which would be totally biased. So your job is to find representatives of all viewpoints and interview those people and include their viewpoints in the story. So no one-source stories. I would say not even two-source stories. If you're doing a short story, I think you need at least 3 sources there. And by short, I mean maybe like 400, 500 words. So these are some of the ethical standards that an editor would expect you to adhere to. Oh, this, by the way, is my tape recorder. I don't know if you can see the greasy stains right here, but I thought I would take a picture of it. So an editor, of course, will also expect that you know how to do reporting. And so much of reporting boils down to being able to do rigorous interviews. And I know Nicholas will talk later about advanced reporting, but I want to touch on some interviewing basics, things that have helped me over the years. One of the first things is when you approach your sources for interviews with requests, always be specific in your request. Like mention why you're why you're contacting this particular person and what is it that you want to talk to them about. You don't have to send them questions ahead of time, but I think it is helpful to just mention some general areas that you want to touch upon in your conversation with them. And even though I would say don't send them your questions ahead of time, I think it's a good idea for you to have a list of these questions because in the heat of the moment when you're interviewing somebody, you can easily forget an important question, which is not to say that you can't ask any follow-up questions. In fact, these always come up. But you know, as an anchor, in order to stay focused, it's good to have a list of some questions just for your own benefit. So be specific when you approach people and always mention how long the interview is going to take. I find that especially people who don't have any experience with being interviewed, they don't know how long things take. They think, oh, it's going to take an hour, when in fact it usually takes like 10 minutes or 15 minutes. So do mention roughly how long it's going to take, and then stick to that time. And if you find yourself going over, do apologize and ask for permission, like, can we talk a little bit longer? You know, don't assume that you're entitled to their time, even though they're not doing us a favor. And another really important thing, and this is where my tape recorder comes in, always record your interviews, because this is basically the only way to ensure that you will get accurate quotes. But even as you record your interviews, one thing I love to do is to always take a very detailed notes, and when I hear a quote, I would immediately write it down in shorthand, and I would also write down the time code where that quote appeared so that I can go back to my tape, so I don't have to listen to the whole thing. And I find that taking notes and writing down the quotes as they arise is really helpful, because sometimes tape recorders malfunction. It's actually happened to me. And then if your notes are detailed enough, then you can easily take these verbatim quotes that you have managed to capture. And related to that, if you did not manage to get a quote, you cannot ever fabricate quotes. So the only thing that can go within quotation marks is a verbatim rendition of what was actually said. If this is not what the person actually said 100%, then it's not a quote, but you can paraphrase it and still attribute it to them. And the last one, oh, this is like really important. So often, as you probably know, when you interview people, they're like, can I see my quotes before the story comes out? No, you cannot. This is absolutely not allowed. Do not ever let sources see their quotes or the story draft before the story comes out. I have discovered, however, that one thing that allays people's concerns when they tell me, can I see my quotes? And I say, no, you can't. One thing I like to do is I tell them, okay, but at the end of the interview, I can summarize for you your own main points, just to make sure that I understand what you're saying, just to make sure that we're on the same page. And this usually allays people's concerns. And it's actually also very helpful, I find, for the reporter, because it gives you the chance to double check, okay, did I really understand what this person said? And it gives the source an opportunity to correct you. This has actually happened to me a number of times when at the end of the interview, I tried to play back to them, to summarize to them their own main points. And they're like, no, I didn't exactly mean this. I meant this. So it's a good opportunity for them to correct you. And this is especially true if you're like discussing some very complex subject matter. Like in my case, it was business or rather investing. So these are very tricky concepts. So I always want to make sure that I understand. Sometimes those sources will say, no, unless I see the quotes, I can't talk to you. And in this case, I say you have to drop the source, because you can't allow yourself to be like blackmailed like that. I've had to drop sources a couple of times because of that. But I think this is probably also a red flag, because this is probably going to be like a pain in the ass kind of source. So if somebody is coming with these kinds of demands, no, just no. Let me see. Okay. And I want to go quickly over, again, some expectations that an editor will have when you're filing your story. And again, this is true whether you're filing, so whether you're filing as a staffer or as a freelancer. And this, by the way, is my Canadian Press style book. I decided to take a picture of it. So the first thing that an editor will expect when you submit your story is that it is 100% accurate. So everything in it has to be completely fact-checked. If you have finished your story and there are still things in it that you're not entirely sure about, go back and double check. Now, this could mean going back to your source to ask a question, or it could mean going online and doing some additional research, but it should always be 100% accurate. You should be 100% confident that everything in there you know the answer to. Always make sure that the story doesn't have any personal opinions or personal comments, unless you're writing an op-ed, of course, but we're not talking about op-eds here. They will also expect that your story has a strong lead and a strong nut graph. Do you all know what a lead and nut graph is? Yeah?
What's a nut graph?
So the nut graph is the thing that comes right after the lead. So the lead is the introduction, it's the opening sentence. It's basically the sentence which says, well, this is what the story is about, this is what the news is. And it has to be concise. It has to be engaging, not sensationalist, but it has to be engaging and interesting. And right after that lead, you have to include a sentence, I guess if you're writing a feature especially, giving a little bit more information about where this story is headed. Basically, why should I bother reading this story? What is the angle? It's really important to be able to state early on in the story what the story is about and why the reader should care. This they would definitely expect. Another expectation an editor would have is clear language. So what I mean by that is I've often seen from my experience with editing, but also with being a reporter, is that a lot of times a writer, when they don't understand something, it's too complicated, they would borrow the language of their source or the language of a report or whatever other source they were using. And they would just hope that the editor would understand it or the reader would understand it, even though they themselves don't quite understand what it means. But this is not a good strategy. You have to, before you start writing your story, you have to be at a point where you are able to articulate, to explain to yourself in a very clear way what the story is about, what the issues are. Because your language has to be so clear that anybody can understand this story. Anybody who is reading this story, who doesn't have a background on that issue, they need to be able to understand your story. And related to that is to always provide the proper context. So the details that are relevant, do provide those. People shouldn't have to, go to Google to find the background of your story. You should be providing them with that background. And I guess another one is to make sure, always self-edit, make sure there are no typos, the names are not misspelled, and to use Canadian Press style. How many of you are familiar with CP style? Okay, so several of you. So for those who are not familiar, the Canadian Press style is the style that outlets here in Canada follow. And so some outlets do not follow CP style, but their style is very similar to CP style. So if you know CP style, this will really help you. And it basically refers to conventions such as always putting the period inside of the quotes, for example. They would expect these kinds of things from you. So they wouldn't expect a reporter to be as well-versed with CP style as a copy editor would be. Outlets usually have their own copy editors, but they would expect that your copy is clean and that you do know the basic the basic things. And I would highly recommend, if you ever get a chance to get your hands on a copy of the style book, it's a really helpful resource, because in addition to providing all of these, providing the guidelines about their own style, so their own style rules, it also has very useful guidelines about journalism and ethical standards in Canada. So I think it's a really wonderful resource, and even local libraries have it. So definitely highly recommend it. And a couple more things that an editor will expect when you're filing a story is obviously always meet the deadline. Deadlines in this industry are absolutely sacred. If you cannot meet a deadline, let them know ahead of time, but don't just bust the deadline and then contact them after the fact and be like, oh, hey, actually, I'm late. Well, they already know that. You're gonna piss them off. This is like really, really basic, but really important. And obviously, if you're going to be late, explain why and kind of ask for permission. Another important one is do not exceed the word count. So if they said, I want 1,200 words, do not send 1,500 and tell them, I didn't know where to cut, you do it. Well, part of the journalist's job is to be able to self-edit and to know where to cut so that you can get to the desired word count. And a couple more things. So once the editor gets your story, they will have their edits. Always be open to the editor's feedback. Now, in my experience, unfortunately, most editors, what they do is they take your story, they put their edits in, they send it back, and they're like, hi, here's my problem with your story is this and this. Okay, thanks, bye. And they don't ever acknowledge any of the good things that, you have achieved with this story. Like, they wouldn't say, oh, great lead, great quote, great writing. They would just highlight the problems. So for me, I'm a super sensitive person. I think all writers are. I would see this and I would be like, what the hell? You just completely failed to acknowledge that I worked so hard on this story, and all you have to say is that I have to clarify this one sentence. And so what I'm getting at is be prepared for feedback that might sound harsh or almost unfair. It is unfortunately a requirement. Thick skin is a requirement in this industry. And be open to multiple revision rounds. So especially, I think, with features, sometimes it takes 2 or 3 revision rounds. So be available, be open to revising. If they're constantly asking you to make changes, there's usually a reason for that. So be cooperative. But that being said, if there are certain changes that they're requesting, or certain edits that they're making that you don't agree with, or that you think are making the story inaccurate, definitely push back, definitely mention that, because it's supposed to be a collaborative process. Editing is supposed to be a collaborative process. I know some editors, I've worked with such editors over the years, they have a very authoritarian approach, but that's usually not a good editor to work with. Always be wary. It's supposed to be a collaborative process. So if you don't agree with certain edits, definitely let the editor know, but don't just undo their edits behind their back, because that will piss them off. If you want to undo an edit, let them know, and you can discuss it. And I think, oh yeah, just a couple of very quick things before we wrap up is it's important to stay informed. 2 websites that I do recommend. It's important to follow I think the discussions about what is happening in the Canadian media industry. 2 websites that I would recommend. One is Canadaland. Are you guys familiar with Canadaland? Another one is JSource. You're probably also familiar with JSource. And one more website that I like, which is not a Canadian website, but it does have great tips in terms of pitching, negotiating payments when you're a freelancer, how to negotiate your pay rate, all kinds of things like that. It's called The Write Life, so write as in writing, thewritelife.com. So it's also a great resource. And if you're on Twitter, be on the lookout. I see a lot of editors. They often post calls for pitches. For those of you who are looking to freelance, editors often post calls for pitches on Twitter. So be on the lookout for those and follow other journalists. And that's all I have to say. So I guess if you have questions, we can. Yes.
Yeah.
The people who are watching us, everyone knows we have a live webinar. So if you can, since now I have a mic. So I just want to remind the people who are on the webinar, you can send an email to collective@newcanadianmedia.ca, and we will actually voice your question here in the room. So for those of you online, please send us your questions.
Oh, awesome. I don't know how much time we have, but yeah.
Hi, thank you so much. Really enjoyed your speech.
My pleasure.
I need to add one more thing for New Canadian Media specifically, because I've been mentoring some of the writers over here.
Yeah.
And it's very, very interesting to see the variation in viewpoints. But a lot of you come from different backgrounds. Not all of you have a news media background. So I've had pitches and I've had stories that look like a blog. 4 steps to so-and-so. This is not a blog. I've had a lot of stories that focus more on the audience back home in their home country. We are talking to a Canadian audience. It's very, very important to remember the audience that you're addressing. When you write for CBC, it's very different. When you write for an immigrant-based magazine, it's very different. When you write for ethnic media publications in Canada, it's very different. So it's very important to identify the audience and what you're writing, the style of writing, and how you're presenting it, apart from other things. Thank you.
Absolutely. I think it's very important to know your audience or know the audience of the outlet that you're pitching to. Exactly what Joyita said. I totally second that. It's very important. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Khalid. I've been in media for almost 20 years now. So just a thing to all the new immigrant who's been here for less than 1 year.
Yeah.
There are a lot of mainstream companies, they're going to ask you to intern, and they're going to ask you intern for free. Okay, so me being less than 10 years, I have given my trump card to a lot of people. If you're working for free, trust me, they're they're making use of you. You're not going to make any network. You're not going to get a job. So when they are called to intern, please put a value to yourself. Yeah. Otherwise, like next 10 years, you'll be struggling to find things for yourself. I've been for conferences like University led by by CBC, where they want to include all the diversity and give them a job. And after that, trust me, they don't even forget about picking a call. They don't even reply to your email. Do not devalue yourself for doing free internship to everybody.
Yeah.
Put a value for yourself, and learn from these kind of conferences. Do the right things, but do not do anything for free. There are a lot of freeloaders, they make billions of dollars, but they do not want to pay, especially to new immigrant. There is a big, divisive thing going on, but it's changing. The landscape is changing with more immigrant coming, but if you have a skill, do not devalue yourself. Yeah. Do not do anything for free, please. Thank you.
Yeah. This is so important. I am so glad you mentioned that. Definitely be aware of that. I 100%, I agree with that, because you do have to value your skills, and you do have to have an idea of what you're going to charge. What do your services cost? And again, whether we're talking about a freelancing situation or you're going to be hired as a full-time staffer, absolutely. Because part of the reason why so many outlets want other people to work for free is that so many people agree to work for free. But if most of us said, no, I'm not working for free, go try and find somebody who's able to work for free, and they can't. So thank you, this is very important. Yeah, and I think it's especially important for immigrant women, because again, there are studies out there which show that we get paid less than Canadian-born women and less than immigrant men, because women, unfortunately, myself included, I've made this mistake so many times. We don't negotiate enough. Like, I'll give you a quick example. When I got my first Canadian job here at a business magazine, and I was on the phone with HR. They had already sent me the job offer, and in the job offer they had listed the salary that they're going to pay me. I knew I was supposed to negotiate, but I was so nervous because I didn't know how to negotiate. I wasn't raised, you're with the idea that you have to negotiate, you have to push. So I just said this half-hearted thing, well, is there any room for a higher number? And I was totally mumbling. And she's like, no, unfortunately, times are tough, blah, blah, blah. And now from my perspective now, from what I know now, that's the wrong way. You don't say, is there any room? You say, I've done my research, these are the rates for this kind of work, and I believe that given my background, given the work that I've done, I should be, at the higher end of this range, and the salary that I had in mind is X. And then she'll say, oh, okay, well, we can't maybe get to X, but what about this? Do you see what I mean? So that was a big mistake that I made, a rookie mistake. Thank you so much. Money is such an important part of this question.
The other thing that we can remember about pitching is you don't just have to limit yourself to pitching for a Canadian audience. Yeah. So all of you, most of you speak another language or have come from another homeland. So don't forget that you can actually take a story about what's going on in Canada or elsewhere, and you can pitch that to, the other, so a local outlet. Let's say if you're from Turkey and you're living here now in Canada, you can actually take the story about what's happening here in Canada and pitch it to an outlet in Turkey, right? So, and that's something that we overlook sometimes, is that you've got this diversity, you've got this flexibility, so use it.
My name is Atta. I'm from Nigeria. And so I've heard the phrase, we against us. And so my question is that, who is them and who is us? In my time here, I've suffered more discrimination from immigrants than from citizens. Yes. And so another thing is that if one gets into an environment, one should study the environment and have a strategy of how to maximize your skill, your education, and all that. I have a degree in civil engineering, and I'm presently working in a consulting firm. But my life is journalism. And the issue of Canadian experience is more in engineering than in most other places. But I've realized that there is always a way to go about anything. Because if we are not careful in this forum, we would end up having a pity party. Yeah. There is a way. I've spent like 15 months here now, and I already work in a consultancy, an engineering consultancy. And engineering is not even my passion. It is journalism. So what I'm saying is that, and you've mentioned it also, there is a way to overcome barriers. In our countries, there are barriers. Where we are coming from, there are barriers. And so we must have a mindset that everything that we want to achieve is achievable. It might be difficult. It might be very, very difficult. But there are ways to go about it. I want us to have that mindset. Thank you.
No, I agree. I think we do have to acknowledge the obstacles that we face, but we also have to think about, okay, what steps can I take within the limitations that I have? What steps can I take to further my cause? So I don't disagree with you. I just was saying, though, that I think it doesn't help us immigrants when we paint a rosy picture about life in Canada, because that is also inaccurate. Because then when you don't get the results that you want, you're thinking, well, I guess I'm not smart enough. I guess I didn't work hard enough. When the reality is that we don't all start. It's not a playing field. We don't all start at the same level. Like somebody who was not born and raised here, who doesn't have a Canadian passport, who, all of these things that we mentioned, has to work harder, in my experience. But you're right, there is, it's a tightrope, it's a balance. It shouldn't be, we shouldn't just be wallowing in self-pity, you know. Okay, that's it, I can't do anything. Yeah. We have no time?
There's actually always three ways, I found. So when I was starting out 30 years ago, I actually, free is sometimes good. I got up, thank you, yeah. I was on, you're gonna hold it? I started working at the CBC at the age of 16. I was a young person talking about what it's like to be a teenager. And it had emotional resonance because 3 days before I went on, sorry, it's better if I hold it because, or you, yeah, that's good. 3 days before we went on the air to promote a play about teen suicide, my best friend's girlfriend committed suicide. And I had never met her, but her death had impact on me. And 10 years later, when I bumped into my friend, he still mentioned it, even though he'd had other girlfriends and life went on. And I was able to convey that emotional resonance. Yeah, it had power. That's what I talk about, passion and honesty. There were phone calls. It was before email. There were, you know, so there were people left messages going, wow, it's the first time we've heard Canadian young people talking about their feelings. And nobody knew Derek Luis was not a white guy and a white kid. My name is Derek. Right? But I was born in Tanzania. So anyway, there weren't a lot of people who looked like me in media, but I got on for free. I got my foot in the door. And then I went and studied journalism at Centennial College. I couldn't afford Ryerson. Couldn't afford it. We were working class. It was thousands of dollars a year. I could pay, at that time, $1,200 and go to, my entire program, I think, cost $1,800 for the 2 years at Centennial. But I went and I walked in for free to Ryerson, and I looked at their job board and their bulletin board, and I jotted things down. And I applied. I had no right. I applied for the CTV national internship with Lloyd Robertson, and I got it. I got it. I can tell you how, in a break or something like that, but I got it. I made these breaks. So you could go to Ryerson and pay $300 for one of the cheapest courses they have in their news certificate. $300 and something. They have a course that's also $900. If you take 5 or 6, you get a certificate in news. But you could just take that one course, and now you can say you're studying news production at Ryerson. Put that on your CV and keep pitching away at the world trying to get your stories, but now you have Ryerson on your resume. And it was important for me. I knew, like you said, Ryerson, Canadian grade A stamp on your forehead, but I can't afford the $26,000 for the 4-year degree. But I went and took night school courses. So there's always a way. And how do they get around it? If your name isn't Linehan or all the names of the great journalists at CBC, you recognize them. Some of the people have all the old names that their fathers and uncles and mothers have. They're from the news family. They get in. There's others who just went to the right schools and they're all part of this group. Anyway, there's ways around. Some of them actually go and they get jobs at some little newspaper somewhere in Barrie or Kenora or some other, Kingston. There's fewer of those, but there's ways. Even writing and putting your story in, you need 5 stories to have a portfolio at least. Start writing, start getting that list. Think of yourself as a radio journalist. No one says, there's less barrier there. Think about being a digital journalist, taking photographs, recording. So there's ways. Sometimes you need to throw your thing in there for free to get your foot in the door. Right? When I went and volunteered, I volunteered at the coolest place, City TV, for 3 weeks during Caravana. I got free food. It was awesome. City TV everywhere. It was awesome. But I managed the time that I was giving for free. So you might have to compromise a little. Don't compromise your values, but be willing to choose wisely where you do things for free to get in. You got to build that Canadian portfolio.
I'm very curious. What I'm very curious, what inspires you to be with NCM over here? And what's the biggest difference that you see in new Canadian media's journalism and mainstream journalism from CBC? Thank you.
Thanks. So I'm inspired by change, and like I said, there's impact for me personally being in a room with people of color. I don't see this in the media sector. It's maybe 3 out of 10 are people of color. So I think the number at CBC is, I think, 6%. It's definitely less than 10 of diverse people. So it's good to be in an area like this. So my passion is trying to fix things. I've been a passionate person about change. So my solution is to create a platform that helps journalists, whether they're graduate students, graduates from colleges and universities, or foreign trained professionals, to get on a platform that gives them Canadian experience where they write and shoot. And so I'm building that solution right now, volunteering my time. And anyone who comes on board is going to have to volunteer like I am. We're building something that is like a practice company. So that's why I'm here, is to keep going. And I'm actually an executive. I worked my way all the way up as a vice president and CEO in media. I was an executive producer. I did all those jobs over 20 years. I produced one of everything, like docs. I produced a drama, made-for-TV movie, radio drama. Started in print, worked my way up into media over the years. Won pitching competitions. So I've seen it all from the inside, and I have said, well, wait a minute, where are all the other CVs? Where are all the others? There's 30 in this pile out of 300. Why didn't you give me this guy's name or this person's name? Oh, I couldn't pronounce that name. It's awkward, and I called them, and I can't pronounce that name. And I'm like, oh my God, it's true. If you're going to change your name or alter it, some people are doing it because to get beyond that little one person who should have put your name in the pile. It's shocking when I saw it. It's one thing you hear when there's a stat, but so I want to be part of this to connect with people and learn more and grow, because every 5 years, if you're in media, especially if you move to management, you can get laid off. Media is one of those sectors like travel, tourism that also is susceptible to the economy in a big way. So you have to always be growing, and I'm an immigrant journalist. You know? But I want to help in this whole thing. I want to be part of it, and I'm learning. And yeah, like I said, I want to help. I want to create opportunities for others. But it's also so inspiring. I loved your energy when I met you, and the way you talked about the struggle and some of the silliness around the Canadian citizenship.
Yes. The struggle, capital S, yes.
Yeah, but you were so inspiring, right?
Thank you.
And it's just like there's these little techniques. There's always 3 ways. The Ryerson trick. There's to go to a small place and do it externally if your name isn't a famous last name in journalism, or you didn't go to all the best private schools and are part of this network. I've seen it all. Or if you don't know someone on the inside who can get your resume in, and you might be going to a place that is impossible to get in. Like, it's hard even for me to get a full-time job at CBC because, first of all, I'm overqualified, so there's all those personal things. But also, they don't really hire that many people from the outside. They hire people from the inside. So if you're banging your head trying to get into somewhere where it's almost impossible to get in, you shouldn't be wasting your time there. You should be going somewhere else. Someone has to tell you that, right? So anyway,